It has been a while, and quite frankly, a bit too long. And honestly, it's mainly because I haven't really had the drive to really do this, as certain communities have since killed any enjoyment that I had making content for a good long while. But I was recently reminded about why I enjoyed it. And it was getting information and my own thoughts out there on certain topics that I previously was unable to articulate before, having it put into a way that makes sense to me. And that happened as of recently. And I wouldn't say this is a response or rebuttal or otherwise like difference of opinion. I would just say that this is my view on a certain topic. So, say Brock. He made a video not too long ago talking about how forced tropes aren't for everybody, but how he likes the idea of forcing tropes onto certain aspects of certain games. And in the video, he gives an example how elves in 4th edition D&D, they get a boost to their dexterity and their wisdom, and that the classes that primarily use those stats, with it being like the ranger, the rogue, the druid, the shaman, these are classes and themes that are typically associated with elves in media, whether that be written or anime or TV shows or movies. Elves are usually depicted as being entities associated a lot with stealth and archery and nature. They're always nimble and light on their feet, and so classes like those I described make a lot of thematic sense and have this trope of elves being this way. And I do agree to some notion that players who are more inclined to do more optimal plays and more optimal thought processes tend to lean into these tropes more than other players, because they are building they make their build and then they build their character based on that. And it reminds me a lot of what people say about 4th edition, where every character feels the same and like every class is the same, but then people argue, including myself, that no, they are actually quite different, and it's just a difference of how you build the character. Like, yes, you could have 2 elven rangers, but they could have totally different personalities, totally different ways of going about things, and the way they build their ranger is different from each other. Very distinct. And with that, I do agree. In terms of forcing tropes, these make sense for a game like 4th edition, where things are put in such a way that it is very similar to modern day RPGs, considering how RPGs take a lot of inspiration from 4th edition as well as D&D in general with how their systems work. But where I think I differ when it comes to Cybrock's opinion on this, So he said the name. He said the name of the movie in the movie. That's cool. Anyway, I think where my opinion differs from Cybrock's opinion is he describes how the forced tropes are really a byproduct of 4E's design, as well as any other D&D version's design, where their attacking and defending stats are dictated by their attributes. So, strength and dexterity, being your normal attributes, directly enhance or hinder your combat prowess, and dexterity also directly helps or hinders your defensive capabilities. And how if you were to separate the attribute system from any sort of combat prowess, the game on a basic level becomes better because it opens up the door for more build diversity instead of forcing tropes. But he says that while this is a good thing in a lot of instances for games like D&D and like the hero fantasy, it's very tricky because you lose the identity of the trope. Where, yes, elves are seen as mostly the rangers and the rogues, it doesn't stop you from doing something like a Goliath rogue. It doesn't stop you from doing that, but the system heavily implies or insinuates you should be building characters and races with such a way that they complement each other. But he says that with a game or a house rule that states that, races don't really matter and they're kind of just whatever one you think looks better and you can just put your stats anywhere, you lose the theme of, you lose the class race dynamic, and so each race doesn't really have anything unique to themselves where certain races are good at certain classes and it makes sense in the world. When you open it up, it kind of loses that. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And here's why. Because if we look at a game like 4th edition, races matter a little bit, but they also matter quite a bit depending on what build you're going for. Like I said, if you're going for an elf character, you typically want to pick one of the classes that fits well with the boosts of your attributes that the elves give you. Because it not only makes your class better, it synergizes because the races and the classes were meant to work together in the way that they were designed. However, if you look at a game like Fabula doesn't have races. They don't have this notion that a certain race can only do certain things or anything like that. It is, how he describes it, a spectrum of game design where you can either have a full package deal of classes and races that work specifically with each other, and that's how the game is meant to be played, versus a really open system where it's kind of like, whatever, just kind of do whatever you want. Fabula's kind of in the middle where they don't have any races, and I think that enhances the gameplay. But if it was just like D&D, where they had a class that you picked and you had to stick with it the entire time and you couldn't diversify, or if you did diversify, it would be you had to do it in a very specific way or use specific rules, or there was like some funky rulings that caused problems or made characters too underpowered or overpowered depending on how you looked at it, I think it would be a far worse game. Fabula has found a way to make a game where there is an equivalent of races in the form of quirks, but they aren't tied to a character's appearance or stats in any way. They are just there to basically help you. It's essentially a mechanical backstory is the way I think of it. It's a mechanical benefit that aids in you as the player creating your character. And I think it's a far better system, in my opinion, than 4E, because I always found when I was testing out 4E and reading it, how restrictive it felt. Like these tropes were being pushed on players. Like, if you don't pick this class and you don't pick this race together, you're not being optimal about it. And that, again, 4th edition doesn't force you to do this, but with the game being designed the way it is, it does heavily incentivize, and I would argue almost forces players to pick race and class combinations to be the best, because if I'm not mistaken, there's not really a rolling option for stats. Like, you could, I know there was an optional rule in there somewhere, but if you use like the offline tool, then it's default point buy. And so you're basically being forced to make a race class combination that fits well. And if a player, if you're at an optimal table, doesn't want to play an optimal class race combination, they're at a severe disadvantage. Not a severe disadvantage. They're at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the party, unless the class race combination, though the stats of the race don't match with what the class is attempting to do, it makes sense because the abilities that the race gets complements the class well. But in 4th edition, what I've found is that that's not entirely the case. Mostly races are given abilities and skills that directly help what the game designers had intended to be, I don't want to say the word pigeon-held, but incentivize the players to play. So elves are given skills and abilities that directly help with things that a ranger or a rogue or a druid or a shaman would want to do. So I'm not saying that 4E is a worse game. I'd probably put it like right below Fabula Ultima in terms of my favorite games. Well, actually, I'd probably put it Fabula is number 1, and then 4E is number 2, and then Lancer right below it. But I would say Fabula is a better system when it comes to player choice than 4E, because there's a lot more nuance to the character building than in 4E. Again, that's just my opinion. I still think 4E is a great game, and I would prefer to play it over 5th edition any day. But if I had to choose between 4E and Fabula, I'd probably pick Fabula.